before we get started, I just want to say my hoodie came and I'm so happy with it. I got a personalized hoodie which has my photography logo on it. It's all embroidered, which is really nice, and it is embroidered on the back as well, which is just my website. So although it's quite expensive to get it embroidered, it'll last a lot longer than printed. So definitely recommend getting a personalized hoodie if you're a freelancer. But that is not what you're here for today. You're here for something different. Okay, so you clicked on this video because you want to know the basics of photography. And don't worry about it, all photographers have to start somewhere. So there's no need to worry, we're going to talk through each element today. And the three main elements are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And let's just say these three elements are so important that without one, the rest wouldn't work very well. Put it like this cup of coffee. I need the coffee, I need hot water, and I need milk. I mean, some people have black coffee, but let's just go on the assumption that you like milk in your coffee. So if I didn't have hot water, then just coffee granules and milk would not be a very good combination. It would not be enjoyable. So by having all three elements, they work well and come out with a better outcome if used correctly. Okay, so why don't we start with ISO? ISO, it sounds great when you first hear it because think of it as artificial light or fake light. And what it does, it just makes the sensor inside of your camera body more sensitive to light. So that means in dark rooms, dark events, music events, you can bump up the ISO to make the image appear brighter. But people think it might sound amazing at first and then bump that ISO to the extreme where they're like, yeah, the higher it is, the better it is. But that's not the case. The best thing to do as a rule of thumb is keep as close to 100, which tends to be the lowest number for most cameras. My camera goes below 100, but obviously I've spent the money to get a camera that can do that. But general rule of thumb for starting out, stick to as close to 100 or as low as possible. Like, don't be afraid to go up 100, 500, 1000, but just be aware that the more artificial light you're pumping into the camera, the more chance of it being grainy. This is why people spend a lot of money on camera bodies, because they can handle ISO very well. So I have peace of mind that if I'm bumping my ISO up, I don't have a problem because I know my camera can deal with it. But I still always try to stick as low as possible because the more natural light you're using, the better it is. So yeah, don't go too hard on the ISO. Use it when needed. Okay, next point, aperture. Aperture is an interesting one because it technically has two functions. So we'll talk about the first one, which is actually something you can visibly see. Before we get into it, I just want to clarify, f-stop and t-stop are completely the same thing. They're both measurements for aperture. It's just f-stop is for photography and t-stop is for videography. And the difference is between the mathematical equations. So f-stop, it uses focal length, and t-stop is using the amount of light transmitted. That's a bit technical, so we'll just keep it plain and simple. We're calling it f-stop, and that's what we're going to use to call our aperture number. So back to my point, if you change your f-stop, if you make it higher or lower, you'll notice if you look into the lens, the blade's moving in the lens. But the weird thing is, the higher the number, the smaller the hole, and the lower the number, the bigger the hole. That took me a while when I first started to get my head around because it seems a bit backwards. But just remember, the bigger the number, the smaller the hole, the lower the number, the bigger the hole. So that is just common sense of how the bigger the hole, the more light is getting in, etc, etc. So the next point with aperture is how it affects the depth of field. And a simple way to explain what depth of field is if you just get your image, if all of it is in focus, you've got a deep depth of field. You're covering all the ranges, all the distance, and you're getting everything in that distance in focus. And if you look at your image and you've only got a few things in focus, then that means you've got a shallow depth of field. So to get a deep depth of field, you need a higher aperture, a higher f-stop. To get a lower depth of field, you need a lower f-stop. So two examples they give for this is a wide landscape shot where you want everything in focus, you want all the mountains in focus, you use a higher f-stop. This can be around f5 up because everything will be in focus. This also goes for group photos, so not everybody has group photos where they're stood in a perfect line. To risk not having someone out of focus, you want to have a higher aperture to kind of just make sure they're all in focus. So a good example for a shallow depth of field is, say you're taking photos of a dog and you've got a really low aperture, you've got a 1.2 aperture. You focus on the dog's nose, and because of the 1.2 aperture, it means only that nose will be in focus. The rest of the dog will all be blurry, which is normally called bokeh or bokeh, whatever you want to pronounce it as. But that out of focusness is what people really like in photography nowadays and what people strive for. So having these low apertures and shallow depths of fields comes at a cost. You might have your own little setup right now, which is a starter kit. If you've noticed, the higher end lenses are very costly. Not only is this because of the glass they use, so it's sharp, it's also because of the aperture. People want it as low as possible. They want that option to have a low shallow depth of field. Not only do you get your shallow depth of field, you also just get a lot more light in the lens, which means you're using less ISO. Things are starting to work together, if you see. So aperture is the blades inside the lens. The lower the number, the bigger the hole. The higher the number, the smaller the hole. It affects the light going into the camera, and it also affects the depth of field. Right, last element is shutter speed. So I feel like shutter speed's fairly simple. It's measured in seconds, so if you've got 320 as your shutter speed, it's 1/320th of a second. If you've got it as 100, it's 1/100th of a second. So it's just how fast the shutter's going to capture the image per second. I also feel like I'm doing ninja stuff right now. So if you're shooting something, say, that's a sport, it's a moving subject, it's moving quite fast, you need a higher shutter to freeze the moment in time. So everything's sharp and that moment is frozen in time. If you're shooting someone that's just sat there for a headshot maybe, you don't need your shutter that high. So 1/80th, 1/60th, as long as they're not moving around, you can have a fairly low shutter. But that doesn't have to be regimented. You could have a fast moving subject and use a slow shutter to create a bit of movement, a bit of motion blur, to have an artistic effect on it. For example, a long exposure of a waterfall. Here is one with a high shutter and here is one with a low shutter. So if you have a slower shutter on moving water, whatever, it's known as a long exposure. So this doesn't mean that you have to have a high shutter speed if your subject is moving. So this can be used for traffic, anything that's moving quite fast. You can literally put your shutter as 2-3 seconds and you'll have something that's called a long exposure. This is where you're opening your shutter for longer and you're letting more light in and letting more movement in to create a long exposure, and it's quite a cool effect, quite an artistic effect. So another example of long exposure you might have come across is astrophotography. They will set their camera up and lower the shutter speed quite a way down, maybe quite a few seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, so you can get your camera to absorb all the lights of the stars, all the details, and it just creates a beautiful image. So yeah, I think that's pretty simple. If you've got a moving image, higher it a bit more. If you've got a static subject matter, you can lower your shutter speed quite a bit. So hopefully that makes sense. All these three elements work off each other. Some people might say, okay, I'm shooting in bright sunlight, but I want shallow depth of field. Say I've got a 1.4 lens. I've heightened my shutter speed a bit, but I want a bit of motion blur in my image, and I've put the ISO as 100. What can I do? Because my image is still overexposed. That is where things like ND filters come into play. They're basically like sunglasses for your camera. Stick it on the front, it'll lower your exposure, you'll be able to use your low aperture and get your motion blur and have your ISO on 100, which you would do anyway. Whereas if you don't have an ND filter, you'll either have to sacrifice your motion blur or sacrifice your shallow depth of field, if that kind of makes sense. So overall, those are the three elements that make up photography. You need to know them off by heart. So go out, try it, experiment. If you've got any questions, make sure you leave them below or message me directly, I don't mind. We all start somewhere, and that goes for everything. We're a beginner at some point. So yeah, if you did find it helpful, make sure you hit the thumbs up button, subscribe down below if you're new, and hit the notification bell if you want. And I will see you next time. Bye!